My name is Michael Thomson. For almost 20 years, I was a paramedic in Oakland, California. Before continuing, I was impressed that the last video even had comments from Germany. It makes me curious to know, how far will this experience I'm sharing with you reach? Tell me in the comments which city or country you're watching me from. And since you're here, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. Just press the red button below. As I was saying, I was a paramedic in Oakland, California for almost 20 years. I grew up on the tree-lined streets of the Temescal neighborhood, where my father worked as a carpenter and my mother taught at the local elementary school. It was an ordinary life. Baseball games at MacArthur Boulevard Park on Sundays, family dinners at the oak table my father built, discussions about chores and bills to pay. The kind of life most people lead without questioning their own mortality. Until that night, in March 2002, when I not only witnessed death, I walked through it. I'm sitting here in my home office with the window open to the backyard where my grandchildren are playing. I can hear their laughter as I relive this memory. For 15 years, I kept this experience to myself and a few very close people. Not out of fear of ridicule or professional judgment, although that was also there, but because some truths are so profound, so transformative, that you need time to fully absorb them before sharing them. Have you ever had a dream so vivid that when you woke up, it took you a few minutes to realize it wasn't real? Now imagine the opposite, discovering that what you thought was the whole reality was, in fact, only a small fraction of something much bigger. That's what happened to me. What I'm about to share fundamentally changed everything I believed about life, death, and what comes after. And if you've ever lost someone you deeply loved, a parent, a mother, a child, a friend, perhaps what I have to say might bring some genuine comfort. Not the kind of comfort based on hope or faith, but on direct experience. So take a deep breath with me. This is a long story, and it begins, like many stories about death, with life at its most vulnerable. It was a particularly severe winter in the Bay Area, the kind of winter Californians complain about as if it were the end of the world, while people from Minnesota would just laugh. But for us, it was brutal. Constant rain, unusually low temperatures, and a flu epidemic that had left our healthcare system on the brink of collapse. I was working at Station 8, near Lake Merritt. We were a team of 5, me as the lead paramedic, 2 EMTs, and 2 firefighters. We had been doing double shifts for almost 2 weeks. The hospitals were operating beyond capacity, with patients on gurneys in the hallways. Emergency rooms had waiting times of 8 hours or more. It was controlled chaos, the kind of situation in which emergency professionals like us excel, even as we collapse inside. On the night of March 17th, we received a call to a residence in Piedmont, an affluent area nearby. We arrived at an imposing Victorian house, the kind that makes you wonder about the stories its walls could tell. The door was opened by a middle-aged woman. I later found out she was a university professor from Berkeley, with eyes red from worry. "It's my mother," she explained as she led us upstairs. "She's 92 years old and has had a high fever for 3 days. This morning she couldn't get out of bed." The room was dark, heavy curtains blocking what little daylight there was on that cloudy day. In the center, an old bed where a small, fragile woman struggled to breathe. Her name was Eleanor Williams. According to her daughter, she had been a nurse during World War II. I immediately began the assessment. Temperature of 103.2 degrees, dangerously low blood pressure at 85/60, oxygen saturation at 82%. She needed to go to the hospital immediately. "Mrs. Williams," I said, approaching with an oxygen mask, "I'm going to put this on your face to help you breathe better, okay?" She nodded weakly. I leaned over her, adjusting the mask around her nose and mouth. It was at that moment that she coughed, a single violent spasm directly into my face before I could fully position the mask. I wiped my face with a towel, put the mask on her, and we continued with transport to Alta Bates Summit Medical Center. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Exposures happen in our line of work all the time. We use precautions, but sometimes the inevitable happens. 3 days later, I woke up at 4:30 in the morning with intense chills. My wife, Sarah, said I was shaking so hard that the whole bed was moving. Temperature, 109 degrees Celsius. Just a flu, I thought. I'll take some Tylenol and be fine. By the 5th day, the fever persisted, and I could no longer retain fluids. Each attempt to drink water or eat anything ended with me running to the bathroom. Dehydration was setting in rapidly. On the morning of the 6th day, I got up to go to the bathroom and nearly passed out. I dragged myself back to bed and asked Sarah to bring me a mirror. What I saw frightened me deeply. My face was unrecognizable, pale as paper, with eyes sunk into darkened orbits. It looked like a Halloween mask of a corpse. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I need you to check my pulse." "Ah," she placed 2 fingers on my radial pulse and frowned, moving them to different positions. "I can't feel anything," she said, fear evident in her voice. "Try the carotid pulse," I instructed, pointing to my neck. She found a pulse, but it was weak and irregular. Later, she told me it was beating at about 150 BPM. My heart was working furiously to maintain circulation with drastically reduced blood volume. "I think I need to go to the hospital now," I said, trying to stay calm for her. Sarah called an ambulance. Ironically, it was my own colleagues from Station 8 who responded. I saw the recognition and then the shock in their faces when they entered the room and saw me. "Jesus, Mike, you look like a ghost," said Martinez, a firefighter I had worked with for over a decade. "Feel like one," I managed to reply. At Alta Bates Hospital, my blood pressure was 70/40 and dropping, severe dehydration. They inserted 2 large-bore IV accesses and began administering fluids at full speed. A doctor I knew, Dr. Patel, who had treated many of the patients I had transported, took my case. "Mike, it looks like you caught the same strain of influenza that's knocking everyone down," he explained. "But in your case, there was an extreme systemic inflammatory response. Your body is essentially at war with itself." I gave a small nod, already feeling the effects of the medications they had started administering through the IV. I remember asking about my wife. "She's in the waiting room," Dr. Patel replied. "We'll stabilize you and then she can come in." A nurse approached with 2 syringes. "This is for nausea and pain," she explained. "I'm not in that much pain," I mumbled. "Just nausea and weakness." The last thing I remember was the nurse saying, "These are doctor's orders. Everyone with these symptoms is getting the same protocol." She injected the contents of both syringes into my IV. I felt an intense cold rising up my arm, then my neck. My vision began to darken at the edges, like an old TV being turned off. I heard someone shout something about blood pressure and then darkness. Later, I discovered what happened. The pain medication was Dilaudid, a potent opioid. In my severely dehydrated state, it caused a dramatic drop in blood pressure to 40/0, practically undetectable. My heart continued beating, but there wasn't enough pressure to adequately perfuse the organs, including the brain. Technically, I wasn't dead, but I was dangerously close. Close enough for my consciousness to begin detaching from the physical body. What happened next is the most difficult to explain. Our language was developed to describe shared physical experiences, mountains, rivers, the taste of an orange. We don't have adequate vocabulary for experiences that transcend the physical, but I'll try with the understanding that any description will inevitably be inadequate. Suddenly, and I mean literally with no perceptible transition, there was no more pain, no more nausea, no more weight. It was as if I had been carrying a backpack full of rocks my entire life, so constantly that I had forgotten it was there. and someone finally removed it from my shoulders. The first thing I noticed was that I was completely lucid. More lucid, in fact, than I ever remembered being. It was as if a filter had been removed, a filter I didn't even know was there. I realized I was looking at my own body from above, not exactly floating on the ceiling like in movies, but from an expanded perspective that allowed me to see everything at once. I saw Dr. Patel initiating resuscitation maneuvers. I saw the nurse running to get the emergency cart. I saw another nurse gently leading Sarah out of the room, despite her protests. But here's the strangest thing. I didn't feel fear. Not for a second. There was no panic, no, "Oh my God, I'm dying" sensation you might expect. There was only curiosity, fascination, and a growing sense of liberation. It was like being a prisoner who had spent his entire life in a small cell, only to discover that the door was never really locked. You just never thought to check. The sensation was one of expansion. As if until that moment I had lived inside a small box called Michael Thomson, with all its limitations, fears, anxieties, and social roles. And now I was free from that artificial constriction. But the most surprising thing? I was still me, completely me. My consciousness, my memories, my sense of humor, my ability to observe and reflect, all of this remained intact. In fact, I felt more myself than I ever had inside the body. I remember thinking, with a kind of amused amazement, so this is what I really am. Not that body, not that name, not that personal history, but this consciousness that observes, that experiences, that knows. And there was one more thing. A sense of recognition, as if I already knew all this, as if I was remembering rather than discovering, like returning home after a long journey and instantly recognizing the smell, the sounds, the feeling of being exactly where you belong. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone in that state. Around me, or perhaps through me, it's hard to say, what I can only describe as waves of conscious light began to appear. They weren't lights as we physically know them. They were living, intelligent presences, pulsing with what I can only call pure love. These presences didn't have a defined human form. They were more like, imagine sunbeams dancing through morning mist, but conscious. Now imagine that these sunbeams could communicate directly with your mind, transmitting not just thoughts, but complete emotional states. The colors were extraordinary, not just the colors we see with our physical eyes, but shades I've never seen before or since. Colors that seemed to have meaning, that conveyed information, that had an almost musical quality. And the most amazing thing, these presences knew me. Not Michael Thomson, Oakland paramedic with a mortgage and knee problems. They knew the true me behind that temporary identity. And the recognition was mutual. I knew them too, although I couldn't remember from where or when. Imagine the most welcoming feeling you've ever experienced in life. Perhaps when a newborn child was placed in your arms for the first time, or when someone you deeply love looked into your eyes and said, "I love you," with complete sincerity. Now multiply that feeling by 1,000, by 1,000,000. It was as if every particle of my being was being bathed in liquid love. It wasn't a directed or conditional love as we usually experience on Earth. It was more like a force field, a natural state of being. As if love were the basic material of the universe, the fundamental substance of which everything is made, usually hidden by the density of physical experience, but now completely revealed. In that moment, I had an absolute certainty that remains with me to this day. I was never alone. None of us ever was. We are always surrounded by this loving presence, only we are usually too distracted by the density of physical life to notice. It's like living next to an ocean, but never hearing the waves because of the traffic noise. Another certainty came. Death was not the end of anything significant. It was just a transition, like moving from one room to another in a very large house. The essential I continued intact. As I moved through these waves of light, or they through me, it's hard to say, I began to laugh, a deep laugh of relief and recognition. How could I have forgotten? How could I have spent decades believing I was just this limited body with all its fears and anxieties? How could I have taken daily concerns so seriously? Bills, status, small conflicts, aging, fears of the future. It was like waking up from an intense dream and realizing that you are not the character you dreamed about. You are the dreamer. All the identities I had built, the dedicated paramedic, the worried father, the sometimes distant husband, the Oakland man who rooted for the Raiders and complained about traffic on the Bay Bridge, were just temporary roles. Masks that I had confused with my true face. The true me was much larger, much deeper, much older. And that true me was neither born nor died. It simply was. With this realization came a wave of compassion for myself and for all human beings. How brave we are to voluntarily enter this limited experience. How valiant we are to temporarily forget our true nature in order to fully play this game called human life. I could see my entire life as a single coherent pattern. Each challenge, each relationship, each mistake, each triumph as part of an elaborate tapestry whose design I couldn't perceive while immersed in the details. I realized that even the experiences I had considered bad had served an important purpose in my development. And something else. I realized that I had chosen this specific life, not consciously, of course, not the conscious Michael Thomson, but at a deeper level, I had chosen precisely these circumstances, these relationships, these challenges, for reasons that now seemed perfectly clear. This understanding brought a sense of responsibility, not the heavy, guilty kind we often feel on Earth, but a light, almost joyful responsibility. The responsibility of an artist for his creation. In a way that I cannot fully explain, I could feel the presence of the people I had lost throughout my life. My father, Joseph, who died of a heart attack when I was 20. I felt his presence not as a ghost or apparition, but as a familiar, energetic signature. That dry sense of humor, that stubborn integrity, that silent depth I had always associated with him. My grandmother Margaret, who passed away while I held her hand in the hospital when I was in college. Her welcoming nature, her practical wisdom, her unconditional love, everything was present, not as memory, but as living reality. Johnny Esposito, my childhood best friend who died in a motorcycle accident at 16. His playful energy, his courage, his adventurous spirit, all still vibrant and real. They weren't there as separate entities, not in the way we're used to thinking. It was more as if they had always been present, only I couldn't perceive them before due to the limitations of physical perception, like radio waves that are always in the air, but you need the right receiver to pick them up. It was then that I understood something that completely changed my relationship with death and grief. Nobody really gets lost. Nobody disappears. We just change state, like water turning into vapor, less visible to human eyes, but still completely present. And more, I understood that the bonds of genuine love transcend physical death. They are not broken when the body dies. They are permanent, part of the structure of the universe. Every true connection we form persists, regardless of what happens to our bodies. This understanding filled me with a deep sense of peace. All the losses I had suffered, all the grief I had carried, I realized it was based on an incomplete understanding. I was mourning the loss of physical presences, without realizing that the essence of these people remained accessible in a different way. And it extended beyond people. I could feel the presence of animals I had loved. Our old Labrador, Max, the Siamese cat from my childhood, Sammy. Their consciousness also continued, was also part of that larger tapestry of interconnected life. In that expanded state, I could clearly see how our culture has built an extremely limited view of reality. not out of malice or conspiracy, but through a narrow focus on what can be measured, weighed and verified by the 5 physical senses. We treat death as the absolute end because we have been conditioned to believe that we are only our bodies, that consciousness is just a product of the brain, a side effect of chemical reactions and electrical impulses. We have developed an entire society based on this premise, structuring our lives around accumulation and preservation, always fighting against the inevitable physical decline. There, floating in pure consciousness while my body was near death in the ICU at Alta Bates, I had the absolute certainty we were deeply wrong. Life is much bigger than matter. Consciousness does not depend on the brain to exist. It uses the brain only as a receiver, as a radio uses an antenna. When the radio breaks, the transmission continues. It's just no longer being received by that specific device. I could see how this fundamental misunderstanding created so much unnecessary suffering. Our fear of death leads us to live lives of quiet desperation, always aware of time passing, always trying to hold on to what inevitably slips away. And perhaps most importantly, I realized that the fear of death is the root of practically all other human fears. The fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of poverty, the fear of illness, all of them ultimately trace back to the fear of mortality, of cessation, of non-existence. When you remove that fundamental fear, an incredible freedom opens up. You can still make plans, have goals, work to improve circumstances, but without the oppressive burden of believing that this brief life is all there is, that each mistake is an irreversible tragedy, that each lost moment is lost forever. I saw how modern medicine, despite all its wonders, and as a paramedic I witnessed these wonders daily, had inadvertently contributed to this fear by medicalizing death, by removing it from the natural cycle of family and community life, by treating it as an enemy to be defeated at all costs, instead of a transition to be understood and, when the time comes, accepted. Amid this state of ecstasy and understanding, something changed. The sensation of movement, which until then had been similar to floating or gliding, became more directed. I felt myself being guided to what seemed to be a more structured space, with a different quality of light, softer, indirect, almost like light filtered through stained glass. There I encountered what I can only describe as presences. They didn't have a human appearance, but they were definitely individual beings with distinct personalities. 3 of them seemed smaller, denser, somehow closer to human form, although definitely not human. They wore something like dark robes with hoods, and emanated a playful, almost mischievous energy, like children about to play a prank, but in a loving way. There was a 4th presence, taller, as if made of luminous mist that constantly changed shape. This one seemed older, wiser, and somehow seemed to coordinate the meeting, though not in an authoritarian way. It was more like a facilitator in a gathering of close friends. "Michael," said the taller presence without using real words, but communicating directly with my consciousness, "how was it this time?" This time? What did that mean? Before I could fully process this disturbing question, one of the smaller presences turned to the others and commented, with what I can only describe as a mental chuckle, "He doesn't remember us." And they all seemed to find this extremely funny, not in a mocking way, but with genuine delight. Like adults watching a child. Learning to walk, I had a strange and overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if in fact I knew these beings, had been with them before, many times, but couldn't fully access those memories. "I know you?" I asked without words. "Of course you do," replied one of the smaller presences, with something that seemed like an expansive smile. "Just not this time, in this form. It's always like this when you're immersed so deeply." Then the taller presence approached. When this happened, I felt a wave of love so intense that it seemed my expanded being would explode with emotion. It was like standing before a sun of pure love, overwhelming, but somehow not painful, just immense. "It's time to go back," it clearly communicated. It was like a bucket of cold water. "Go back?" I replied, shocked. "No, I can't go back. This is real. That was the dream." "Both are real," was the calm response. "Just in different ways." "But I belong here," I insisted. "I remember now. This is home." "And it will always be your home," replied the tall presence with infinite patience. "But you have work to do." I tried to argue. I explained that my body was sick, that going back would be painful. I said that my family would be sad for a while, but that they were strong people. Sarah would eventually find someone else. My children had their own lives. My parents were already gone. Who really needed me there? "You have work to do," repeated the presence, but this time with a firmer quality. "What work?" I asked, frustrated. "I'm just a paramedic in Oakland. I'm nobody special." The tall presence just smiled, not with a face, but with its entire being. "That's exactly why you need to go back," it replied with infinite gentleness. "It's not about who you think you are. It's about who you can help with what you've learned here." One of the smaller presences then approached, communicating, "Remember, even if you don't fully remember when you go back, remember the love. Remember that nobody really dies. Remember that you are never alone." And then, before I could protest further, the tall presence said, "We will always be with you. We always have been." I didn't have a chance to respond. The environment began to dissolve, like a TV channel losing its signal. The presences seemed to move away, or perhaps it was I who was moving away from them. I felt myself falling, descending through increasingly dense layers of consciousness. The sense of expansion began to reverse. It was like being gradually compressed, confined, limited again, like trying to force the entire ocean into a coffee cup. The freedom and clarity I had experienced began to diminish, replaced by a growing sensation of weight and constriction. There was a brief but intensely uncomfortable moment where I passed through a space that caused me deep uneasiness. It was like a shadowy region between worlds, neither the luminous expansion I had experienced, nor the comforting density of physical life. It was a place of confusion, of fragmented identities, of lost purpose. I instinctively knew it was a place where consciousnesses can get trapped when they resist the natural flow too much, whether desperately clinging to physical life when it's time to leave, or refusing to return when they still have work to do. It wasn't a hell in the traditional religious sense, but it definitely wasn't a place where you would want to remain. I passed through this space quickly, as if being pulled by an invisible thread. And then, with a violent shock that seemed electric, I was back in my body. The pain returned instantly. The weight, the limitation, the sensation of being confined to a tiny space after experiencing vastness. It was like being forced to wear a wetsuit several sizes too small, every movement restricted and laborious. My eyes opened. A nurse noticed and called for the doctor. "He's coming back." Pressure rising to 80-45. "Doctor." Patel appeared in my field of vision, looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved. "Welcome back, Mike. You gave us quite a scare." I tried to speak, but couldn't. There was a tube in my throat. All I could do was cry. Not from physical pain, but from a deep sadness at having lost that connection, that freedom, that unconditional love. It was like being expelled from paradise. Not as punishment, but still deeply painful. Dr. Patel squeezed my shoulder. "It's okay. It's normal to get emotional after what you've been through. You had a severe reaction to the medication, combined with extreme dehydration. Your heart kept beating, but your pressure dropped so low that you probably had a hypoxic episode. We'll keep you here for a few days, but you'll be fine. A hypoxic episode. Lack of oxygen to the brain. The standard medical explanation for near-death experiences. I had used that explanation myself many times for patients who reported similar experiences. But now, lying there with a tube down my throat, tears streaming down my face, I knew better. What I had experienced was far more real than the hospital room, the beeping monitors, the concerned faces looking down at me. Those things were real too, in their way, but they were the shallow end of a very deep pool. I spent 5 more days in the hospital before being discharged. For weeks, I struggled with a depression that my wife didn't understand. "You survived, Michael. You should be happy," she would say, genuinely confused by my melancholy. How could I explain that I had experienced something so extraordinary that it made ordinary life pale in comparison? How could I tell her that I had been home, truly home, and now was exiled again in this dense, limited existence? But gradually, something changed. I began to realize that I could bring a bit of that experience into my daily life. I didn't need to be dead to feel connected to something larger. I started meditating, something I would have scoffed at before. I found that in deep stillness, I could sometimes recapture a hint, a whisper of that expanded state. Never as complete, never as overwhelming, but enough to remind me. My work as a paramedic was completely transformed. I began to see each patient not just as a body to be treated, but as an eternal consciousness temporarily limited by a suffering body. I developed an ability to be present with the dying that my colleagues noticed. "How can you stay so calm when we lose someone?" they would ask. I would just smile. How could I explain that nobody really gets lost? My relationship with Sarah deepened. I became more present, more patient, more accepting. The small irritations that had once seemed so important, her leaving cabinet doors open, me forgetting to take out the trash, now seemed laughably trivial. We were eternal beings playing temporary roles. Why waste precious time in conflict over nothing? I also became much more willing to take risks, not reckless physical risks, but emotional ones. I started writing poetry. I volunteered at a hospice. I reached out to estranged family members. What was the worst that could happen? Rejection? Failure? Those fears seemed insignificant now. The most profound change, though, was in how I related to death and loss. The paralyzing fear was gone. Not just the fear of my own death, but the fear of losing others. I still didn't want people I loved to die. I wasn't detached or callous. But the terror, the sense that death was the ultimate catastrophe, the end of everything, that was gone. In its place was a deep, abiding peace, a certainty that no one is ever truly lost, that love continues, that consciousness persists, that we are far, far more than our physical bodies and circumstances. After some years, I carefully began to share my experience with specific people, those devastated by the loss of a loved one. A mother who lost her son in a shooting in East Oakland, a man whose partner died of cancer after 20 years together, a 12-year-old girl whose twin brother drowned in Lake Merritt. For each of them, I offered not just words of comfort, but the absolute certainty that came from my experience. Your loved one has not disappeared. They are not gone. They are more alive than ever, just in a form that your physical eyes cannot see, and they are still with you, closer than you imagine. I saw the relief in these people's eyes. It wasn't faith or hope I was offering. It was direct knowledge. Testimony from someone who had been there and come back. One woman who had lost her husband suddenly to an aneurysm asked me, "How can you be so sure? How do you know they're not just gone?" I took her hands and looked directly in her eyes. "Because I've been there. I've seen it, I've felt it. The body dies, but who we really are continues. The connection, the love, that doesn't end. It can't end, because it's woven into the very fabric of the universe. She began to cry, but they weren't the same tears of desolation she had been shedding for months. They were tears of release, of possibility, of hope, grounded in something more substantial than wishful thinking. "I keep feeling like he's still with me sometimes," she whispered. "Like he's right here, but I just can't see him. I thought I was going crazy." "You're not crazy," I assured her. "You're more perceptive than most. Those moments when you feel his presence, trust them. They're real, more real than most of what we call reality. Over the years, I've had dozens of these conversations. Each time I see the same transformation, from devastating grief to a quieter sadness still tinged with loss, but fundamentally altered by the knowledge that death is not the end, that no one truly disappears, that love continues beyond the physical. And I've noticed something else, something unexpected. These conversations are healing for me too. Each time I share my experience, I reconnect with it. I remember a little more clearly. I feel a little more of that boundless love that I experienced on the other side. It's as if, by helping others, I help myself remember who I really am. Perhaps that's the work I was sent back to do. Not something grand or dramatic, just these quiet conversations, these moments of connection, these small dissolutions of the great fear that haunts humanity. Today, 20 years after that night in the hospital, I've finally decided to share this story publicly. Not to convince anyone of anything, but because I feel it's time. Our society is facing enormous challenges, and fear, especially the fear of death, is at the root of so much unnecessary suffering. If there's one message I can leave, it's this. Death is not an end. It's a passage, a transition, a return, what we essentially are, our consciousness, our capacity to love, that never dies. And while we're here, in this physical plane, we have a simple but profound mission: to love more, to fear less, to remember who we really are, beyond the temporary identities we inhabit. If you've had a similar experience, or if you've lost someone and felt their presence afterward, I'd like to hear your story. Share in the comments below, because the more openly we talk about these experiences, the more we can heal the collective fear that keeps us separated from each other and from the larger truth about who we are. From Temescal, Oakland, this is Michael Thomson. Thank you for listening.